station, 1370 WOCA.
Ocala.
Diamonds in the sunset, now your time has come.
All right, 8 minutes after 9 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this Monday morning.
Into the sun.
Let's talk about the Keystone XL pipeline. You know, this is kind of a no-brainer, I guess. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to me. You know, we get oil and we bring it down by pipeline. It's probably the most efficient, even the most environmentally sound way of doing that task of getting oil from one location to another. And yet, some people are opposed to it. I honestly don't know really our next guest's position on this, but that was my opinion right there. But I kind of wonder sometimes when you look at this whole Iraqi thing going on right now. I mean, the numbers are unbelievable. There are 250,000 troops in the Iraqi army. 250,000. And not to mention the fact that they've got planes and tanks, and they were trained by our forces, by American forces. So a quarter of a million troops, and they're being outdone by 7,000 troops. That doesn't even make sense to me. And they don't have the training, they don't have the hardware, and yet they are supposedly winning. I sometimes wonder if, with all the conflicts in the world, why are we paying so much attention to this one? Why are 7,000 able to defeat, or appear to be defeating 250,000? Why are the soldiers in Iraq giving up their weapons after a 2-hour standoff? Wasn't that one of the stories? A 2-hour standoff? They threw down their weapons and they ran away? Or are we being manipulated? Is this really about oil? And is it really one source of oil versus another? If we didn't have to have Middle East oil, wouldn't it make more sense that we wouldn't have to worry about oil being even in the equation? Dan Kish is on the phone. He's the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. He is on the air to talk to us about the Keystone XL pipeline. And there was a story about a billionaire activist named Tom Steyer, and he's going to tell us about that and his efforts, I guess, to donate money to prevent climate change, and we're getting that thrown at us too. You know, how do you feel about that? So let's see what our guest has to say. Dan Kish, we are so looking forward to hearing from you, and we're honored that you're on the show with us today. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Larry.
How are you?
Good, and I hope you're well as well.
And where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm in Washington, D.C.
Okay. So where do we start with this? I mean, are we being manipulated, or are there real issues going on here? And did I throw you a curveball by connecting the situation in Iraq with the Keystone Pipeline?
No, I actually I think they're obviously connected. I mean, one of the many reasons why we should build the Keystone Pipeline and should have been building it and probably receiving oil from it already is precisely because we can get our oil from the Middle East, we can get it from Venezuela, we can get it from a lot of places, but there's not a better place in the world to get it from right here in North America. It's cheaper to transport. It's easier to transport by pipeline, obviously, than tanker and railroad car, which is what's happening now with that oil that would have been coming down through the Keystone Pipeline. And it puts us less in jeopardy from all of these terrible places around the world that just happen to have oil, because as it turns out, what we've been told for 30 or 40 years by our government, that we're running out of oil and don't have any, is simply wrong. We've got it in enormous quantities right here at home, and in those places where we're allowed to go after it, we're having incredible economic growth. So across the board, this makes sense. National security, economic, jobs,
right.
Growth, you name it.
And environmentally, I'm not an expert, but it just seems like a pipe that breaks down is going to spill less than a ship that sinks, or you know, does that make sense?
Yeah. No, exactly. Well, I mean, think about it in your own house. Larry. I mean, rather than have all these people throw this nonsense at us, let's think about it. If we have a pipe that breaks in our house, and certainly our pipes aren't as thick or comprehensive as this pipe would be, what we do is we turn off the valve closest to it, and it stops the flow of it. And that's exactly what happens with modern pipelines. And you do get a little bit of leakage, but compared to carrying buckets of water through the house to flush our toilets and take showers, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And that's what we're doing now because we can't build a pipeline.
So the environmentalists, let's start with them, who don't want us to have the pipeline, they have a weak debate. I don't know what the whole point is here when it looks like the best way, the most environmentally sound way of transporting oil is with a pipeline.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what the government's 5 so far reports on the Keystone Pipeline. The government has actually paid to have 5 exhaustive, and I mean exhaustive, reports done on the Keystone Pipeline, and each of them has said it's the most environmentally sound way. But you mentioned something about Tom Steyer earlier.
Yeah. Who is he?
Well, he's a billionaire. He was kind of born with a silver spoon in his mouth and went to all the best schools and then started a hedge fund and made all of his money by investing in development of coal mines in Australia and Indonesia principally. Actually, Indonesia is the largest exporter of coal in the world to China and other places in the Pacific. And that's how he made his money. And then a few years ago, he, after making all this money, he declared himself an opponent of global warming and said that his company shouldn't be investing in these things anymore and left the company. And he's dedicated himself to stopping global warming. And one of the ways that environmentalists have chosen to do this is by trying to starve Canada of any markets for its oil. Canada has some of the largest supplies of oil in the world. These folks who oppose it know that, and this isn't about a pipeline leaking so much, Larry, as it is about them trying to make it so that it's not economic for Canada to develop further supplies of oil, because these folks think we ought not be using oil at all, and if we have a good supply of it to our direct north, this will make it longer down the road before we give up on oil, because we'll have an economic and available source right there, and that's what this is all about.
Okay, well that explains it a little bit better. So we're faced with people who don't want us to use oil at all. Now, real quickly, if there's a way to answer this, I don't know, but if we were able to drive our cars without any oil-based product, we would still need oil for other things, like prescriptions and some other things, correct?
Yeah, somewhere in the range of 45% of our oil is used for other things. It's basics for plastics, which, when you start looking around, are everywhere now.
Right.
And they're also used for lubricants. We'd need them for that. We'd also need them for, it's kind of hard to contemplate any form other than oil, because it has such a huge amount of energy in it. Think about a jet, for example. There's just no way you could do that, given nobody talks about using natural gas for that. Nobody talks about nuclear. Nobody talks about solar or wind or anything else. The way to move a jet airplane is by having a huge concentrated amount of energy, and nothing fits there's a reason we use what we use.
Okay.
Not because somebody picked it. It's because all of us picked it.
I guess what I'm thinking is maybe a better argument than is being. I'm actually trying to be the devil's advocate, but with a better argument. It's almost like I'm saying, well, why don't we stop using oil if it's a finite resource? But the better reason is stop using it so that we have it for these other things, if indeed it is finite. I mean, if we're burning up this important resource in our cars and we don't need to, that would be the better argument than to try to say the world is warming up because of our cars. Well,
that's an argument some people would make. I guess the the argument that I'd suggest in return is you're going to ask an extraordinarily large number of people to shift to a less efficient resource, because there's a reason we use it for gasoline. By the way, I should hasten to add, the amount of oil that we have right here in North America, Canada, and the United States is so enormous that we could continue to drive our cars for over 100 years.
Oh, wow.
Without having to rely on sources from the Middle East, if we chose to do so. Between our offshore areas, between Alaska, between all of the lower 48 states, and then Canada, we have more oil in the ground, and we're finding more all the time than we've used since the first barrel of oil was produced in Pennsylvania over 150 years ago.
Wow. So the message that's not true, the message that we get from a lot of places that's not true is manipulating us in some way. And what is the reason for the manipulation? Is it so that we pay somebody else? Is it all about one guy wanting money and the other guy wanting? Is that what it's about?
Well, that's part of it. I don't think it's just that, Larry, but there are plenty of people who are trying to sell an alternative product that isn't as good. Frankly, because if it was as good, we'd all be using it, right? I mean, if somebody came out with something tomorrow that cost less, gave us more miles per gallon, and didn't put off any carbon dioxide emissions, I'd be using it, especially when it comes to cost. But they haven't been able to do that, and so if they can put up excuses why you ought not use it, even if they're not true, then that puts them in a better position, and sometimes politicians listen to those sorts of arguments. But the government's own numbers show that our supplies of oil are actually so enormous that these shouldn't even be problems. We're creating our own problems by doing things like not approving the Keystone Pipeline.
Now, just to clarify, when you say our numbers, does that include Canada, or do you mean in the actual United States territory?
The United States itself has more than 100 years of oil supply.
Wow.
Recoverable oil.
Wow.
And do we have the refineries to accommodate that?
We've got the largest refining capacity in the world in the United States, and we have adequate refinery supplies to be able to, to be able to supply a huge amount of ours. We could build more, of course, and that's another story entirely. But the United States has enormous quantities of oil. By the way, you can actually find a study that just takes government reports and piles them up on that at our website at energytownhall.org.
Okay, energytownhall.org. That's a good resource. Dan Kish is our guest. He's the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. We are talking about the Keystone XL pipeline. We're also talking about money that gets, I guess, put into the hands of decision makers. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say. When you're talking about energy, it's the largest business in the world. It allows us to have a population without adequate supplies of energy, the type that we use today. The carrying capacity of Earth is somewhere probably less than 1 billion people. We couldn't raise crops to feed 7 billion people. We couldn't move things around. When you think about it, it's the Industrial Revolution was really not an industrial revolution. It was an energy revolution. We went from using renewable sources like wood and things on the surface and a little bit of wind and hydropower to turn wheels, to taking stored solar power in the Earth's battery, if you will. It's sort of like a battery. It has all this energy stored in it, millions of years of that, and brought it to the surface and started using it to amplify human strength. That is what began what is known as the Industrial Revolution. In the case of the British, it was coal. It was coal in the United States, and later oil and natural gas and the like.
And there's so many people out there that have a common sense approach. They've tried to make their case, like about putting filters on coal burning power plants, filters even on the exhaust pipes of vehicles, solar panels on the tops of vehicles themselves, but they all seem to be dissed when they try to move forward to get patents on this and create products.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've actually done significantly. I think a lot of people would be surprised because it isn't popularized in the mainstream media, but an automobile today going down the road at 60 miles an hour produces less pollution than an automobile with its engine off from 1973.
Wow.
We have cleaner air today in the United States than at any time in 100 years.
And we have cleaner water too.
On here.
And I'm not an expert, but just from looking at the rivers I know, particularly the ones around New York City, they look better than they did 20 years ago.
Yes, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I mean, our air in the mid 1900s in the United States looked much like the air that we see in China. That was the industries before we started cleaning them up, and the way you clean them up is by producing enough wealth using energy, frankly, to be able to afford the proper types of filters, to be able to afford every car in the United States is now equipped with a catalytic converter, which basically burns up any burnt fuel that used to simply leak out into the air from an automobile from 1973.
There seems to be the stigma among the political arena that instead of working in conjunction with the energy forms that we have now and then slowly wean ourselves away from that and do new things, that they just want to wipe out everything and then just start from ground zero. I mean, back during President Reagan's term, I think there was actually an electric car that was on the market, maybe did 35 miles an hour, but all of a sudden you didn't hear about it anymore.
That's right. There was a General Motors made a car in California to meet California standards. It didn't work very well, to be honest with you. And even the electric cars today, they have limited applicability. I mean, for those people for whom they make sense, well, all the more power to them. I mean, there's plenty of places in Florida, for example, where people use golf carts, electric golf carts, to get around.
Yeah, we live near one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, it's not something I could get away with here in Washington. You couldn't get away with it in Wyoming. But, for those places, I mean, that's what the beauty of having a free market. Let's choose what makes sense for us.
Absolutely.
If it makes sense for people to hop into a golf cart and zip around, go over to the pool or whatever, I'm certainly not going to tell them no. And likewise, if someone has to haul cattle across the state of Wyoming, I probably shouldn't tell them they should use a golf cart.
Right.
So let's keep the politics out of it, and let's get back to Americans using what makes sense for Americans.
All right, Dan, I have the phones lit up. Are you okay with taking some calls?
Of course.
Okay, let me make sure. I wanted to make sure that it was okay with you before we did this. All right, thank you for being patient with us. I know you've been waiting a long time. Thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Good morning, sir. What amazes me is the people that yell and scream about global warming forget two very important things. Number one, there are more humans than has ever been recorded running around. There have been global warming events in the past. And basically what I'm trying to say now is the global warming, if you look at space weather, NOAA has satellites positioned in around the Earth to monitor the sun. And as a matter of fact, about 7 or 8 days ago, there was a giant solar event that took place. There was 3 eruptions on the sun combined, made it one of the mass coronal explosions ever recorded that since we've been tracking it. And we've had, other than 1859, these last three events that took place one after the other, is astronomical. And our sun has been very, very active over the last 20 years. But we do not hear anything from any of the global warming wizards. And, all they know how to do is tell us that we got to go back to pre-caveman days or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable.
You make a good point. Thank you for the call. And it is, we hear about the volcanic activity underneath Antarctica too, and but in defense of just cleaner air, I mean, whether it's contributing to the warming of the Earth or not, I mean, we all want cleaner air, and I think we've done a pretty good job at that. That's kind of the point that Dan was making earlier. Dan, you still there?
I am.
Okay. Yeah, what do you want to comment on the caller?
Well, I happen to think the caller brings up an extraordinary point that doesn't seem to be ever addressed. If there's one thing that we're sure of, it's that when the sun comes up in the morning, the temperature goes up. And there's nothing which affects our temperature and therefore climate and everything else more so than the sun, and the sun does go through phases, and it's extraordinary. And I tell you that if someone was to ask me why there's less attention paid to that, it's because there's really nothing we can do about the sun, and politicians want to be able to say that they're doing.
That's right. Absolutely. That is true.
So they may be focusing on things that we can control people's behavior and tell them what to do and that sort of thing. We can't tell the sun what to do.
Yeah. If you were trying to get through it and didn't, I apologize. We just ran out of time. Dan, give us the website again that you mentioned earlier.
EnergyTownHall.org.
Okay. Dan, great conversation. Thank you so much for being on the air with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay.
Have a great one.
Thank you. You too. All right, we need to take a break. We'll be right back.
Fox News Radio, I'm Pat O'Neill. As a Sunni insurgency gains more ground in Iraq, Secretary of State John Kerry's in Baghdad to meet with Prime Minister Maliki and other top officials.
As many as 300 U.S. forces